So most of you are probably aware that Derek Chauvin killed George Floyd, went on trial for murder, got convicted and sent to prison. But fewer people actually watched the court proceedings, though if you did, you may have noticed something that most others missed, namely two words that just kept popping up again and again and again.
Symptoms of excited delirium. Excited delirium, excited delirium, excited delirium.
Excited delirium, excited delirium, excited delirium.
Excited delirium, excited delirium, excited delirium, excited delirium.
Excited delirium, excited delirium.
Excited delirium.
Excited delirium.
Excited delirium, excited delirium.
And this didn't just come up in the courtroom, right? Even one of the cops there on the scene while Floyd was pinned down to the ground commented,
I just worry about the excited delirium or whatever.
Right, so what the fuck is excited delirium? Well, in short, it's a medical term referring to someone who suddenly becomes aggressive, excited, sweaty, and agitated, as well as delirious and utterly impervious to pain. And lastly, I'm not kidding about this, they have
Superhuman strength.
Superhuman strength, superhuman strength.
They may have superhuman strength. They'll feel pain.
right, basically, this person just turns into the fucking Hulk, with them just becoming wild, uncontrollable beasts that go on an irrational rampage.
And then the claim is that these people suddenly up and die.
Yeah, the final symptom is spontaneous death. Also, by the way, that is Dr. Aisha Beliso de Jesus, whose book, Excited Delirium, Race, Police, Violence, and the Invention of a Disease, just came out this month. And as that title suggests, she explains that the concept of excited delirium, it is not a real medical thing. It is complete bullshit. But to understand exactly how and why, we have to go back to April 20th of 1980. Right? Because on that day, Cuba's leader, Fidel Castro, made the surprise announcement that anyone who wanted to could flee the island for the United States through the port of Mariel. So with that, you saw Cuban exiles in the US hurriedly renting hundreds of shrimp and fishing boats, sending them there, packing them full of human cargo, with some 125,000 Cubans sailing to the coasts of Florida over the next 5 months. Right? I mean, it was the largest mass immigration of Cubans to the US in history. And it was reported that these weren't just any Cubans, right? Saying they were poorer, less educated, and darker skinned than previous refugees. And so when they arrived in South Florida, they faced poverty and discrimination. They got stereotyped as criminal aliens, even inspiring Al Pacino's character in Scarface. And this, even though only a tiny fraction of them actually had any serious criminal background. Right? So when dead Afro-Cuban bodies started showing up in alleyways, junkyards, and car parks across Miami throughout the decade, they weren't the type to garner much sympathy.
At first, it started out with around 12 Black women who were found what looked like to police and to observers to be brutally raped and strangled to death.
With almost all of them being young sex workers who had traces of cocaine in their system. So to the extent that the authorities cared, they couldn't solve these murders, which is then where forensic pathologist Charles Victor Wetley comes in. See, at the time, he was the chief assistant medical examiner for Miami-Dade County, and he claimed to have the answer. He said they weren't raped and murdered, they just up and died from a combination of sex and cocaine. And this is actually where Wetley begins to develop the argument for what would become excited delirium syndrome.
Also describes it as cocaine agitated delirium syndrome.
With him claiming that victims of it, they don't even need to overdose, just a small amount of coke will do it.
And he makes the argument that Black people in particular have a genetic defect that leads them to die spontaneously after using small amounts of cocaine. At the time it's cocaine, it expands to then later include other drugs such as methamphetamines.
And to justify this claim, Wetley cites Edward Williams, a doctor who wrote in 1914 that
so-called Negro cocaine fiends are causing havoc in the South.
So right from the get-go, Wetley's ideas are explicitly racist, but they find an eager reception in 1980s America. Because it's the Reagan years, the war on drugs is in full swing, and the demonization of Black women as welfare queens is at its ugliest. Also, this image of the aggressive, drug-crazed, superhuman threat has a long history in the white imagination.
European slavers, right, made the argument that Black women had superhuman strength, and so therefore would be better suited to work in the cotton fields.
So excited delirium just basically took this centuries-old racial stereotype and slapped a medical diagnosis on it. And for years, Miami police didn't even bother investigating the murders because Wetley assured them, hey, they weren't actually murders. That is, at least until 1989.
And it's not until 14-year-old Antoinette Burns is murdered and found without cocaine in her system that people start to question the diagnosis.
Right, so Wetley's boss, the chief medical examiner, goes back and revises the past diagnoses, declaring them death by asphyxiation. And the real culprit turned out to be one very prolific serial killer by the name of Charles Henry Williams. He's thought to have killed as many as 32 women and then died himself in 1994 from AIDS while in prison. But Wetley, he wasn't deterred one bit. In fact, in 1991, he reasserted the claim that Black men are genetically predisposed to excited delirium. And pretty soon, medical examiners across the country, they started picking up his idea. Except now, they weren't just applying it to random murder victims. No, instead, they used it almost exclusively for people who died while in police custody. And in almost every case, the person was subjected to some sort of forceful restraint before they died. Whether it's getting hogtied, there was a chokehold, tased, sedated, or like Floyd, crushed by a knee. But instead of putting any of those things in the reports, the medical examiners just listed the cause of death as excited delirium, which then effectively shifted the blame of the person's death off of the police officer and onto the person themselves. Which is why obviously cops loved it, and they started sending corpses to medical examiners that they knew would give them the conclusion they wanted. With in fact a 2018 review finding that more than 10% of deaths in police custody were attributed to excited delirium, according to CBS News. And one of the reasons they knew which examiners to trust with this was that some were literally on the payroll of America's foremost taser company. And that includes Wetly, right? In the late 90s and early 2000s.
He gets hired by Taser International, which becomes one of the sort of primary supporters of excited delirium syndrome.
Right, Taser International, now called Axon Enterprise, hires an army of researchers to spread this lie that tasers don't kill people. Excited delirium does. With that research in hand, the company defended itself successfully against dozens of wrongful death lawsuits. One of these so-called experts telling the courtroom in 2008 that people with excited delirium need to be saved by taser therapy. Now with all this, Aisha says we don't know how many times excited delirium has been used over the decades because no one tracks it. But also arguably, that's exactly the point. Right? Some unknown number of killings simply vanish behind the smokescreen of this fake diagnosis, and as a result, we can't ever know the true scale of police violence in this country. The one thing we can know for sure is that it does affect some people much more than others. I mean, in one study of 166 deaths while in police custody where excited delirium was listed as a cause of death,
Black and Latinx people together made up over 60% of those deaths.
But since the police themselves were often the only voices reporting what happened to the people who died in their custody, it was hard to push back against their lives. So despite criticism here and there from victims' families, independent experts, and groups like the ACLU and NAACP, excited delirium mostly slid under the radar. That is until May 25th, 2020, because by then, thanks to this beautiful thing known as a cell phone, people could hold cops accountable by recording them. Which is of course how the entire world could see with their own eyes that George Floyd didn't just up and die. He was asphyxiated by a knee on his neck. Though, as we saw a few minutes ago, Derek Chauvin's attorneys, they tried to pin his death on excited delirium, and thankfully that failed. Also, something that happened is you had people starting to wonder, well, if this happened to Floyd, who else did they do this to? And all of a sudden, you saw all these names starting to pop back up. All these Black people whose deaths in police custody were attributed to excited delirium.
Elijah McClain, who in 2019 was actually lying down prone, handcuffed with multiple officers on his body when paramedics administered a high dose of ketamine that was sort of too strong for his body. The 2015 death of Natasha McKenna, who was tased multiple times by officers and died.
So with people suddenly more aware of excited delirium and racism in general, the country was ripe for change. And fighting that battle on the front lines was this new generation of medical students with a profound sense of racial injustice.
There's no evidence or clinical diagnostic criteria supporting a diagnosis of quote-unquote excited delirium.
Right, and that's Harvard resident Dr. Rohan Kazanchi, who you also might recognize for being a part of our segment on race-adjusted medicine a little while back. And he says that although delirium is certainly real, as are some other symptoms like agitation and aggression, the special concept of excited delirium, it's much more vague.
It's not something that I would put in the medical record when I'm taking care of a patient with psychosis or substance exposure, a substance overdose. You know, when I see patients in the hospital, I characterize those conditions very specifically.
So in 2020, he and a group of other students brought a series of resolutions to the American Medical Association.
In November of 2020, we brought an item to the medical student section, which was very easily passed.
With that taking positions on a bunch of issues like police brutality, qualified immunity, militarized law enforcement, and most notably,
prohibiting the use of ketamine and other sedative hypnotic agents for law enforcement purposes when there was no medical indication.
And this, as well as a resolution specifically opposing excited delirium. And these easily passed in the medical students section, but when they came to the General House of Delegates, they encountered resistance.
The item was in part adopted, but some of the more specific aspects that we were looking for, like qualified immunity reform and ketamine and sedative and not hypnotics, you know, this conversation about excited delirium, were sort of tabled and sent for further study by the AMA's Council on Science and Public Health.
With the bulk of opposition coming from emergency physicians who Rohan says had concerns about just throwing out excited delirium altogether. Or because people in the field, for example, paramedics, sometimes have to deal with aggressive or out of control individuals. Though of course there you have people saying emergency physicians being predominantly white is arguably another factor to consider.
Certainly when issues like this come to the floor of the American Medical Association, physicians and medical students who look more like the communities that are being disproportionately impacted by police brutality were far more likely to support a resolution of this nature. In fact, the Minority Affairs section of the AMA was one of the strongest advocates for this resolution.
So the AMA, they studied the issue, and in 2021, the results came back, with it firmly endorsing the student's position and denouncing the use of excited delirium, as well as sedative hypnotics like ketamine for law enforcement purposes. And with that, the dam just broke open, with every major group from the American Psychiatric Association to the National Association of Medical Examiners to the American College of Emergency Physicians all rejecting excited delirium. But there's also seeing California and Colorado banning it as a cause of death or diagnosis, and New York moving to do the same. But there's also a catch, because while they abandoned that specific term, the emergency physicians asserted that the existence of one that sounds extremely similar: hyperactive delirium syndrome with severe agitation, and others floating around agitated delirium, exhaustive mania, and restraint-related cardiac arrest. And although the Minneapolis Police Department said that it halted training for excited delirium in 2021, that was only technically true. Because in a PowerPoint slide obtained by the Star Tribune, you can see they literally just crossed out the words excited delirium and replaced it with severe agitation with confusion delirium, with the emergency physician giving the presentation telling the audience that the original term became triggering for the public, with them adding, that being said, the condition exists, we all agree the entity exists. But very much appears that it's going to take a lot more than just changing our language to fix the issue for good. Though also, maybe we should have expected that, given that we're dealing with deeply rooted racial stereotypes here. But hey, all that said, I gotta ask you, what are your thoughts here?